So with the early success of the Penguin series, I just wanted to go back and look into the history and evolution of the Penguin character. And I am going to be looking at all of the major portrayals and the versions that I think have been most impactful on his character development. So I'm not going to cover every single one, but a lot of the major ones that we've seen over the full arc of the character. And there is a lot of overlap here between the comics and anywhere in the different animations. And then, of course, his different live action portrayals. So starting with the early development, we know that the Penguin was one of the original 4 villains of the Batman. This would be along with the Joker, the Riddler, and Catwoman. So he would be one of the oldest Batman villains in terms of just publication alone. So this is really what helped skyrocket his popularity early on, even though you have a lot of different implications of his character, whether on the more simple end or the more complicated end, that I think really makes for an attractive villain here. But starting in his 1941 debut, just given the inspiration and what we know of the early thought process for the Penguin character, we find that he was inspired by the Cool Cigarettes ads at the time, and this was really due to their mascot being a penguin. And also you have elements from Dick Tracy and the Broadway Bates comics in the 30s also being a heavy inspiration for his character there. So that's where you get the blend between both of them. And you also just have the writers really looking to the fashion of the time, with high fashion men really being dressed in tuxedos and really looking like emperor penguins. So all of that really went into the Penguin's development. And then, of course, in terms of history and current events at the time, you also have the emergence and real evolution of the mob. So a lot of those elements are also found in the Penguin's personality over time. So we see his first debut in Detective Comics 58, and we really see the Penguin here start as a skilled thief. He stole different paintings and different lavish things of the time, and he also got a hand in organized crime. He would lead mob heists and become the leader of the mob, but really would take a seat back from that and just become more of an advisor. We really don't see too much of him as a mob head and a gangster until later in his comic evolution. So this is really just to get the ball rolling for his character and really for his portrayal as a more traditional villain. But leading into more of the Silver Age, we see much more of a development in terms of his character, specifically a backstory or origin story. We start to get this here, and this would be little glimpses of the Penguin being bullied as a kid, having an extremely protective mother due to his father dying at a young age. But we also see his parents owning a lot of birds, but would really turn to crime after his mother would die. But then leading into the post-crisis version of the comics, we see more development in terms of the extended family for the Penguin, and we see a much more high society and wealthy background for his family here. But you have the Penguin really being an outsider to society and his elitist family, and this is really where he would get his ambitions to turn to crime. But just due to the nature of how he was brought up, he still would hold on to that formal attire, even though he was by no means civilized. And we always see instances of the Penguin being extremely intelligent. We now get more of a common theme of him owning the Iceberg Casino or just nightclubs in general. And we really see the ambitions for the Penguin just being not only wealth, but more specifically power and respect. This was really just due to the Penguin's insecurities from his upbringing and from the way that he was treated growing up. And of course, you have the umbrella theme that was really developed and has really been established as an iconic piece of the Penguin character. And we see a pretty interesting take on the umbrella aspect here. We have, along with his backstory, a few elements being added to that. That would be his father actually dying from pneumonia, and this is why his protective mother really sent him to school with an umbrella every day. So that's really where we get his hand with with umbrellas here. And then we would get our most descriptive backstory or origin story of the Penguin in the 1989 Secret Origin special. This would be the Killing Peck. And we see not only his upbringing, but really his different instances of being picked on and bullied in school. And this would really be what would tie back to his later revenge on the different childhood bullies and his later ambitions for turning to crime and taking over Gotham. And this is also where we see Oswald being nicknamed the Penguin, just due to his physicality from these early school bullies. So we really see the Penguin term being more of an insult. We get that later, even in the Colin Farrell version of him. So I think not always is the Penguin really considered to be named in a good light in that sense. So really growing up, we just see birds and also books and reading being the only main hobbies and the only positive, if any, instances of the Penguin's childhood. And then in the post-crisis comics, we see more of a backstory that would focus on his abusive father, and this would really just be to him not accepting the Penguin as his son just due to his deformalities from birth, even though, of course, his mother would look after him and would be fond of him. But again, we get the theme of him being bullied for his appearance growing up, and also you have the version of him being an outcast from a wealthy family here. And then we would eventually get more and more deadly and more violent versions of the Penguin to come, and we see him eventually becoming a prominent leader of the underworld. And you also have him being a catalyst for selling different weapons on the black market, and you really see an evolution of his crimes just beyond the initial heists that we see in the earlier comics. And even though the comic evolution would go on into the 90s and even 2000s, going back to the first live-action portrayal of the Penguin, since you don't have any versions of him in the earlier silent films, you get Burgess Meredith being the first Penguin to be seen in action. And I think what's really ironic here is you have the original producers for the show wanting Spencer Tracy for the Penguin role, but really it didn't work out since his vision for the Penguin was to kill the Batman in the show. But Burgess Meredith was their second choice, and really I would say you gotta hand it to Burgess Meredith since his portrayal of the Penguin was really what took him to the next level in terms of the character's fame. Because while you do have lots of people that knew him from the comics, having him on everyday TV is what really made the Penguin a household name. And I would say, if anything, along with Adam West, he's even one of the more memorable characters of the show. And I think what works here is that you don't have too much going on, especially with what they were working on in terms of the style of the show. You really just have the Penguin as a businessman and criminal. You really don't have too much of what looks to be a negative or more cruel outlook on the Penguin. You have him even being a little bit more charismatic and likable, I think, here with Burgess Meredith's acting. And I think in terms of the mannerisms, Burgess Meredith really nailed it here, and I think it really goes to show the versatility of his acting. But then, of course, we wouldn't see the Penguin in live action until Danny DeVito's portrayal of him in the 1992 Batman Returns movie. And this would be with Tim Burton's vision of the character, which would be a lot darker and grim, and if anything, would just kind of make you sick watching this portrayal of the Penguin. But I don't think it was necessarily bad in any sense. I think you have a major impact on the character development of the Penguin overall, just from the extreme lengths that they took with his character here. And we even see this as an immediate impact for the Penguin in the animated series. But since that also came out in 1992, you really have the designs and nature of the Penguin being directly tied to the Danny DeVito version. But of course, this was toned down and made into his own a little bit more into the animated series. But with the Danny DeVito version, in terms of the effect that this had on the Penguin overall, there's definitely comic versions that we see of the Penguin being a lot more of an animal than a human in this instance, and we see a lot more of those animalistic tendencies being brought out from the Penguin following DeVito's edition here. And we even see this being brought out into the Penguin later in different versions, such as the Assault on Arkham take on the character, and just the small role that we get for him here. You really can still feel that intimidating and terrifying presence of the Penguin here, and I really think that's definitely something that adds to the duality of the character. But just going into the thinking process of the development of the Penguin with the Burton series here with Danny DeVito, I think it's really interesting that you have Tim Burton not really knowing too much about the character going into it, and not really necessarily whether it was wanting to do the character or just not really being familiar with him. This is really what caused him to take such a drastic vision of the villain. So he would, of course, take the source material that he would know or study at the time and reinvent the Penguin in a little bit of a different light than what was seen before. We really see this version of the Penguin living in the sewers and kind of being forced to do that since he was abandoned. And then you also have the physical deformalities really taken to the extreme here. So we really see the main ambitions for the Penguin being the common theme of him wanting revenge on Gotham. So I would say in that sense, there's really nothing new, but just looking back at it, I think it was obviously too much. And then going into the animated series in 1992, I would say you still have a pretty good rendition of the Penguin here, even though the episodes that he was in aren't necessarily the best. I do think you have a few of them that are pretty well done, but in terms of the Penguin overall in the animated series, I think you definitely have a classic version of the Penguin here that combines a lot of elements without doing too much in any one category. And I think in terms of the voice acting from Paul Williams, it's definitely one for the books. And then going into other animated series, you also have the Batman in 2004. And I would say this is definitely one of the more underrated but still appreciated versions of the Penguin here. And I think you have a lot more focus being brought back to his family in this instance, really the wealth and past of the family that's now gone, but we really see how much of an impact this has on the Penguin's character as he holds on to more of the sophistication of his family, but is also a lot more rude and cruel. And I think it's just an interesting fun fact. You have the voice actor for SpongeBob playing the Penguin here. That would be Tom Kenny. So I'd say this is definitely another one for the books in terms of the voice acting. And I would say beyond the other editions of him in the animated shows, you really have a lot of development being done for the Penguin in the Arkham series. A really more dark version of the character. I would say you have a lot of heavy inspiration again from Danny DeVito's version here, but definitely not nearly to that extent. Definitely in terms of his physical aspects, you have a lot of similarities. But I would say what really makes this character interesting is actually the British accent for the character, because we know of the more royal or wealthy English background to the Penguin or Oswald Cobblepot. I think the heavy British accent here really works to the Penguin, and this is something that is definitely fitting to what we know of the character. And this would really take heavy focus on the gangster aspect of the Penguins, so I think that definitely works there as well. But I think you really have to look in the Gotham show. The Penguin is one of the better developed versions of that show, and I would say that the Penguin in this instance really steals the spotlight. And with Gotham being the first technical show since the Burgess Meredith version of the Penguin, I'd say you have a lot more time to develop the character throughout 5 seasons here, and it definitely works in this instance. I'd say you have a lot more development on the human aspect of the Penguin here. So you really got to hand it to Robin Lord Taylor's acting. And you also see a lot more of the morally gray philosophies and behaviors of the Penguin being brought out here. And I would say this is what really makes his character interesting in this rendition. I would say you have also a really underrated version of him in the Gotham Knights game. He also doesn't have a major role here, if anything, but still a strong role for the story. And I would say the little bits and pieces that we get of the Penguin here are really effective. You really get the Penguin out of prison and turning away from crime, or at least alleging to that. And we really see him just more as a strict businessman and almost being a advisor and counsel to the Gotham Knights. And I think how we see the Penguin in this sense is definitely how I could possibly see the Penguin in the future, especially with Colin Farrell's version in the Matt Reeves universe. I think just as time would go on, it's definitely possible we see a version of the Penguin here who's much more mature and experienced. So I think that's definitely something to take inspiration from there. But now going into the Colin Farrell version, starting with the Batman in 2022 and now the prominent spin-off show in 2024, I think even just including the Penguin in the universe was definitely a smart choice, since we didn't get him in the Dark Knight trilogy with Christopher Nolan, which is really the path forward in terms of developing the more grounded universe for Gotham and Batman. So in terms of the grounded version, I definitely think you have an extremely successful demonstration of what that could look like just with the inclusion of the Penguin in the Batman movie. And going back to the term Penguin just being a little bit more of an insult in terms of the backstory on his character in the comics, we see that being brought out towards the end of the Batman movie in terms of Carmine Falcone classifying the Penguin as a gimp in a suit. But I would really say what takes this edition a step further from the story, him being bullied and the Penguin being an insult isn't new. What's really new is that the Penguin isn't from a prominent family or a wealthy family in this version here. But I think you really see the Penguin being picked on and bullied here more because he's an outsider for the mob. He doesn't have any family ties, since the Penguin would be from a more disadvantaged background just in terms of his upbringing. And I'd say because of this is really why he gets looked down upon on the other higher ends of the family. And I think going into the show, you have a lot of interesting details that are brought up. You have the addition of Victor, but I'd say what really makes Victor an interesting character and an interesting complement to the Penguin here is that this really humanizes the Penguin, even though we still have a lot of his darker tendencies being brought out, even in his conversations with Victor. Really, his care and slightly more compassionate side of him does shine through, and I think that also adds to the more gray versions of the Penguin character not really being too far out there in terms of being that violent or that cruel in terms of his morals and actions. I'd say this is definitely a really good blend between those here. And just in terms of the acting, I think Colin Farrell is definitely phenomenal, and it's definitely extremely fitting to this more grounded and fully evolved version of the Penguin here. He's almost unrecognizable in terms of the makeup job that they've done on him, but just in terms of his mannerisms and whatnot, you really wouldn't know he's playing a much heavier person, so I really think you gotta hand it to him in that sense. And really, I also think what's interesting about the Penguin show and what's interesting to the development of his character is that you really see the Penguin in terms of his day-to-day life. It's almost like you're following him along on his daily journeys, whereas in the Batman and in the history of the character, he's always been a supporting role that's really mysterious and in the background. And now that we're focusing on the Penguin, it's kind of interesting to see what his lifestyle is like. And I think in terms of Colin Farrell and in terms of the plot, you really forget about Batman. And I don't think that's a bad thing by any means. I think if anything, that really speaks to the effectiveness of the show. And I think also in terms of the physicality, I would say This version of the Penguin also has some elements of Al Capone thrown in there. And also, I'd say you have a lot of inspiration from Tony Soprano and The Godfather. So you really got to hand it to the directors and Matt Reeves for really taking their time and really making this an excellent piece, or a stepping stone, I would say, between the Batman movie in 2022 and the Batman Part 2 to come, and really an excellent piece for the Penguin's character history. And I'm really looking forward to seeing more of him to come. So feel free to let me know if you have any thoughts on this. Really appreciate you watching, and I'll see you later.